The aim of this session really is to tease out how civil society, government, and the private sector can work together better, build better, stronger relationships through and together with other stakeholders and through collective action. So that's really what we're going into. We'll try and bring the spirit of those discussions to the main stage this morning. The panelists will give a very short summary of the discussions, and then we will open up, and hopefully all of you will be able to join the discussion. You can put it on Slido, but please also feel free to use the floating microphones. It will be nice to have some faces to the questions too. So without much further ado from my side, I'd like to hand over. We often like to say for collective action, private sector is essential. So let's kick off with a private sector perspective. And I'll hand over to Cecilia Müller Torbrand, who is the CEO of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, which we all know. And congratulations again on winning the award yesterday. She's been leading it for many years, but also has experience as being an in-house compliance officer in the maritime anti-corruption in the maritime industry, and actually developing collective action from within companies and an industry. So over to you.
Thank you, thank you. And I'd just like to thank everybody who took a very active part in the panel, and my partner in crime, Henche, who I think is also sitting in the audience. So thank you for good running up the session yesterday. It's kind of hard to kind of wrap up hour-and-a-half active conversation in some crisp points, but I will try to. I really narrowed it down to about 6 discussion points we had. We actually started off quite heavy on compliance program building. I think this is a hot topic for many compliance officers. Do we have the right tools to both engage in collective action and also drive collective action through compliance program building? And one thing we specifically focused on was the motivation of SMEs. I think this was a hot topic in the conversation of how do we actually do both capacity building, but also how do we make their lives simpler? I think that was a specific quote. We're all trying to set new standards, pushing compliance, due diligence, as you know, with sanctions, with a new life of sanctions now, we see this year due diligence is just going to get longer and longer. And how do we actually motivate SMEs to also to comply with that? And can we make the life of SMEs simpler by aligning values, by aligning our approaches? So I think I see some nodding here. I think there was a good discussion in the private sector. Can that also be a collective action in itself to really say how do we do capacity building in high-risk market? I also had the fortunate to also have not only multinational companies in our session, but also some of MACN's local partners who are very close working in high-risk market. We had our people from Egypt and India there, and they were also talking about how do you build a trust in markets where we're speaking to each other is not something you do on an everyday basis on corruption risks. So how do you build that conversation, especially when headquarters are coming down? How do you build that trust? And how do you motivate them in local markets to work together? Because that's also collective action itself, that a compliance officer in a multinational company can actually try to incentivize local conversations for change. So I think that was a particular point we did discuss on the whole support of SMEs. And sometimes for international companies, there may also be trade-offs, you know, like we all want to drive our own standard and our procedures. And sometimes I think as a compliance officer, we also have to look at the purpose, right? You know, do we have to do the company way, our way, or can we actually look at what other companies are doing and maybe make the life of the SME simpler because we will reach the same goal? It will be not non-compliant if we not go down that particular route for that for our standards. So I think the alignment of approaches to SMEs was something that we put quite a lot of attention to in the discussion. And then we touched about, you know, companies' misconduct and previous misconducts, and we have some Siemens colleagues in the room who were very open to reflect on the learnings of what you learned a couple of years back. And I think this has been a particular, you know, appreciation from the private sector that you've been open about what happened and what did the company learn from that. And I think we can do better when a settlement hits the press, all the compliance officers, they're reading, what can I learn in my profession? And I think the openness that Siemens has done, I think more companies should actually do that, to say, this is what went wrong and this is how we did it right? Because I think particularly on some of the recent settlements we've seen the past few years, there hasn't been like, that's where the compliance program failed, or this is where we didn't do training enough, or we didn't do... They've actually articulated quite good compliance programs. So I think a lot of compliance office today there's also fear in the private sector. How do we get the right culture, especially if you're working in a multinational company? So I think the settlements and the paying all the money and has a value in itself, but also the knowledge sharing of what a company goes through and learn from each other. I think, I know there are some regulatory limitations, but I think we should continue to challenge that, because it's a really important learning that a lot of companies can gain from, right? Why repeat the same mistakes someone else has learned from? So the appreciation of the transparent, honest dialogue we had in the room, I think we can have more of that. And then, of course, I particularly asked the question, how many actually do have government interactions in their collective action? Because that's, the definition of collective action is something that's been touched upon in this conference in several aspects, but the collective action in the private sector, but then when and how and why do we actually bring governments into the table? And I, who is a firm believer of getting private and public sector together in conversations, was really pleased to see there was a lot of raise of hands and there is government interactions in the collective action. So I think I see that as a really positive development, that we actually can bring governments into the table. And I have a specific memory of that, because the first time MACN brought government officials into our meeting, I called Gemma and I said, can we do this? And how do I do that? And how do I make sure the government officials don't feel they're like in the lion's nest of, and we were also bringing in government officials from high-risk markets where the industry might have a certain perception of how things are done, and there might be also some frustration. And Gemma is also always a firm supporter and a can-doer. We pulled it off, and I'm so grateful and happy to see that more collective action actually having this this public-private dialogue, because I think it's instrumental. So there was a lot of appreciation for that. We also talked about frameworks. Of course, there were references to the OECD frameworks. There are national legislation regulations that has collective action in their guidance to companies. I think the conclusion from the private sector, it can only be more and clearly more articulated, and it should be part of building your compliance program. It should be a part of investigations. Have you engaged in collective action when you try to mitigate your risk in a high-risk market? So I think it's just, I think the whole theme was that we can do more. It can be more better, clearly articulated, but also the appreciation how far we've come. One specific point I want to mention is what's a lot of private sector is on their mind is the ESG reporting, and articulating collective action in the G metrics could be really something that could be a good value next step, because then you have it, right? How's your emissions? Do you do collective action? It becomes very clear what a compliance, what a governance structure could look like. So that was one thing that was particularly set up. And then I just want to wrap up in terms of, we talked about innovation. We talked about, do compliance officers have the right skill sets to look at collective action? How do companies encourage anyone, if it is the CSR manager that has 1,000 other things, or if it's the compliance officer that also have GDPR and misconduct and sanctions, how do you squeeze in collective action in that? And I think that empowering also the professions who work in companies today is important. The skill sets of allowing them in the company structure to think about outside the box, but also how do we setting the skill sets already at universities, for instance, on that this is an important pillar. And then I just want to wrap up. I think there were 3 good quotes that was not, I'm a strong supporter of this, but they were made by others. So I just want to really say they were a really good quote from FAFB, Ken, who said there are things that you just can't do alone. And I think that's the key sentence of collective action and why we need to do it. Someone else said it, or maybe it might be the only way to solve certain problems. There was a recognition we want to be global. Many companies want to be global. They want to be in high-risk markets. And this might be the only way to be compliant. So it's almost like a religious message to say this is the only way forward if you want to be in certain markets. And then I just want to wrap up with Sabine's quote to say, collective action is not that difficult. It just has to be done. So with that, I want to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's already a wealth. No, you're very much on time, and a wealth to follow up on there. But maybe just to cover a couple, it's very interesting to hear the focus on SMEs, the supply chains, the fact that companies are actually looking to learn. And we heard from Mark yesterday that in the beginning, it was very hard for companies to share. And that just also showcased where we are, that people are looking for more. Also that companies feel that this needs to be integrated into their systems, I think is huge in order to drive and mainstream collective action. And of course, also the trust and bringing government. And I think we were just discussing it in the panel, in the fireside chat before, that actually it's happening quite a lot on the ground. And I feel like we need to capture more of that to also inspire and showcase what that can actually look like in practice. So thank you so much for that. It will be very interesting to hear what the civil society perspective will bring into this discussion, and also to hear more about what the role of civil society actually is in collective action. So I'm looking forward to hear more from Professor Dion Rousseau from the Ethics Institute that is headquartered in South Africa, but is also working in the region on business ethics, but also very much pushing collective action in the region. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Scarlett, for the opportunity. The civil society sector is probably the biggest single component to this conference, so therefore we had 2 breakaway sessions, and what we report back here is the consolidation thereof. Now, what we did is also to utilize Mentimeter to just elicit a lot of information from the group. And the first question that we ask people is, so with what sectors are you involved in with your collective action programs that you are currently involved in? And you can see, as could be expected from the previous conversation and also from what we just heard, about 50% of the people involved in the collective actions represented in those 2 groups were the private sector. About 40% the civil society players, and then a minority the government players. So that is quite interesting in itself. But then we asked them, so what is your role as civil society organizations? What is your role in collective action? And they, not unexpectedly, but you can see about 3/4 of the cases, the role of civil society is to be the facilitator of collective action. Some minor roles is sometimes there are also participants. In other words, there are full participants in the collective actions, and in a minority of cases, they might fulfill a researcher role or a monitoring role. Then we turned the conversation to, okay, you are working as facilitators, you are working predominantly with the private sector, but occasionally also with the government, with the public sector. What are your expectations of them respectively? And starting with business, what are the expectations of civil society when it comes to business as players in collective action? And once again, not unexpectedly, was that those who participate from the private sector should practice good governance. They should get their own house in order. And I think it's even more important when you want to engage with government, that you need to make sure that you have your own house in order. And that might take the form of making an anti-corruption or an integrity commitment and stick to it. And sometimes also demonstrate that you do stick to it. And then also not to exploit your role in there and to manage conflicts of interest. That is all part of coming to the table with integrity, I think we could say. Then the second expectation deals with genuine commitment to the collective action objectives and the collective action process. In other words, we want those companies to really be in the game. To show respect for partners, I think it's a precondition for any dialogue, any form of interaction with other parties, that you need to be respectful towards your partners in that process. And then, very importantly, I think, especially from a civil society perspective, that there must be some form of investment in the process. Sometimes financially, other times in terms of capacity or technical skill. And one of the examples of such investment is not only funding these collective action initiatives, but also bringing your technical expertise to, for example, development instruments for monitoring and evaluation. And then, of course, as a collective business, to put pressure on government if you are involved in private-public sector collective action. And very interesting to say, for private sector to really make a difference, you need a mindset where everything is not about profits, but about being ethical organizations who are socially responsible. That's the type of mindset that makes collective action from the private sector really productive and successful. Okay, turning then to expectations of government. And there you can see, and probably there's a reason why that is. First, also, if we look at the distribution of the numbers that we had on the previous slide, in terms of government being the smallest player, that is being open to collaboration, to engage in dialogue, and once again, to respect partners. In other words, to be good, open dialogue partners in the process. Then there's a very clear expectation from government to, as an outcome of collective action, to do something concrete in the sense of revising policy, revising legislation, and then ensuring enforcement thereof. In other words, there must be some tangible outcomes, and ultimately with the view of creating an enabling environment for companies to do the right thing. Something that also came out, and I think it was also reflected in the so-called fireside conversation, was that there should be incentives for change. In other words, if companies do the right thing, there should be some form of recognition, some form of incentive coming from government to recognize changed behavior. And then, of course, I think a precondition always for interaction with government is transparency, especially around access to data. It is absolutely crucial for government, on whatever level you engage with, that they do make certain data available, because that becomes also the basis ultimately for monitoring. And in some contexts, and of course there's no one size fits all, there is also an expectation in some contexts that government should contribute towards the funding of the whole collective action process. Okay, Scarlett, that finally brings us to the civil society value proposition. In other words, what is it that civil society can contribute to the mainstreaming of collective action? And you can see right there in the middle, most prominent is that civil society see themselves as the voice of public interest. In other words, private sector might have a specific interest, government might have another interest, civil society perceive themselves as the voice of the public interest. And in other words, also the advocate for public interest in these collective action initiatives. Then there are four things that are clearly related, and that relates to the role that they can play as a convener. And we've already seen that the predominant role of the civil society is to convene, to be an intermediary. Often there are conflicting views, conflicting interests between the public sector and the private sector. They can play that role as the intermediary. And The reason why they can do it is because they come from a bit more of a neutral place into these collective action initiatives. And of course, very often there might be high suspicion, because why are the public sector and the private sector now talking about this? And just the mere presence of a trusted civil society actor can bring some credibility to that process, especially if there's open communication and transparency around that. The last two things related to the civil society value proposition relates to technical expertise, that very often they might be experts in a certain area, as we've seen, whether it's on the credibility of banknotes or on whistleblowing or whatever other thing you might think of. They might be specialized in a certain area, bring that technical, often also academic contribution to collective action. And finally, we have seen that very often some of these civil society organizations are very well connected internationally. For example, if you think about global compact networks, there's quite a lot of them available here, and they are connected to an international network on which they can draw and also bring in more expertise and more credibility in all of that. So if I need to summarize that, I think the value proposition that civil society can bring to it is that of a credible, competent broker.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dion. It sounds like the civil society has a very clear vision of what is needed from the other stakeholders, but also what they bring to the table. It sounds like from private sector, we would like for them to get their house in order, to commit, and put their money where their mouth is, and for government to really openly engage and also to create more incentives. And the civil society is always there to kind of bring it all together and support that process. So thank you so much for so clearly stating that. And to wrap it up, I will hand over to the public sector perspective. We've heard a lot now already on what the other stakeholders are expecting from the government, so we look forward to hearing what was discussed in their breakout. And for that, I will hand over to Daniela Santana Silva, who's the head of cooperation and international affairs of the Comptroller in Chile. Over to you.
Thank you, Scarlett, and thank you everyone for sharing the thoughts that you guys shared yesterday. My mission is to also share the thoughts of the last ones to come to the party. So governments, and I think it makes a lot of sense, Scarlett, also thank you for thinking this way, because we actually were the last ones to get to the party. And so what I'll try to do is to answer 3 questions. So why should public sector engage in collective action? Who is the one that should do it? And how? But I have to say that even more than discussing all of these questions, we have a lot of further questions. So we don't have necessarily the answer, but I think that having more questions is also an answer, right? So we are just trying to get there and trying to see how we can engage in collective action. So where's why? We also use Mentimeter, and I'm really sorry to Salora, I don't know where you are, but there you are. We exchanged, we co-convene the meeting, and I didn't bring the Menti results, and I'm sorry to everyone that engaged in the Menti, but we asked them what sparks interest in governments to engage. So the most common answer was to create an investment environment, better investment climate. And it really drives from what Dion and Cecilia were just saying, because what we need to do is create this conducive environment in order to engage in collective action. I think that drives from actually acknowledging that we do have a role. So that's a really first answer, I'll say. What we need to do is be in the driver's seat rather than being reactionary. So that's something that we all discussed on how the state or governments were taking a look at what was going on. And now we realize that we actually need to get there. And there's a lot of help coming from international standards and how international community is also stating the fact that state and governments need to come on board. And so that leads us to the question of who in the public sector needs to come on board. And there we, well, don't have an answer properly. There was a discussion on whether we need to have one agency or body that needs to engage in collective action for the state, whereas having a sort of fragmentation on like different actors engaging in collective action on their own entities and their own responsibilities. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So engagement was the key. So whether it's on an agency or whether it's like sort of fragmented, the clear thing is that we have to get in. And so whatever allows us to have agility, flexibility, and adaptability. But the thing is that whether it's, depending on the institution, what we do need is top management to get involved. So tone from the top and establishing that we need to get that political will there. And so that gets me sort of on the how. Because we understand collective action as a process. So it's starting for public sector and governments right now, and it's not nearly to be finished. So also someone was acutely stating that it depends on the language, whether collective action is singular or plural as a word. So we just stated that it should be collective actions. It depends on the language. Of course, there's a language barrier, but we stated that we need tools. We need tools for stakeholders to drive this initiative forward. And that can come from private sector, those tools, and tell us what do you need. That can come from civil society organizations, such as the Basel Institute, to let us know where we can drive, their guidelines, their tools, etc. And that can come as well from international actors and international standards. But we need someone to get those feedback and actually drive them. And so that's where it's really important to have political will and have top management really focused on trying to implement this. Also what we need is to have like sort of tailor-made environment to actually implement collective actions. So we need to understand the political system. And that's really important. So we have a lot of diversity. We had diversity yesterday in the table, and we have diversity of institutions playing a role as well here. And so we need to understand how they work, how they engage with private sector, with civil society, and in order to have actually things that will work. So there is where good practices and sharing good practices come to the table as a really important asset for us to understand how we can drive from there. So, yes, do I have a couple more minutes, or should we go to the questions?
No, if you want to wrap up, that's fine.
Okay, so I'll wrap up, and then we can go to further questions. We also talked about collective action being based on the champion model, and this is what I need to end off. So, including collective actions in relevant documents is really important, but it's not easy nor common to find it right now on laws, for example. So this is where the champion model comes in, and maybe having national anti-corruption strategies or policies that are kind of soft in sort of way that will actually drive from the political will of whoever is in the head of the public institutions. And so different stakeholders can take it up. And of course, it would be ideal to contemplate collective action in these models, whatever form it takes. And so that's really important. And just to wrap it up, something that all of you already stated, and I feel like that's interesting on how synergy is working here, that we have to build further from trust. So we go back to the first panel yesterday as well, and what you already mentioned, that knowing our roles and building on trust will also lead us to working better together. And so I feel like finding creative ways to manage and to engage within trust will lead us to better results and ultimately fighting corruption, good governance, and enhancing democracy. So that's what we talked about a bit. And I hope I delivered properly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniela. And I think it was, I mean, I also joined that group, and it was a fascinating discussion. And the questions that were raised, I think, really put the finger into where civil society can come in and help also governments to kind of understand potentially their role and build those toolboxes and those capacity of sort of where they could come in and be a really effective partner in collective action. And of course, political will being a massive one, not just to do this in the public sector, but also, of course, for civil society and the private sector, and able to get collective action off the ground. Being context sensitive, of course, is very important and well, and building trust. Just to kind of start off the question round, now maybe I can continue with you, Daniela, and then we'll open it up to the rest, to all of you, for questions from you. I think it was also a very interesting comment yesterday about what is the ultimate goal of the public sector in collective action, and how they take up collective action outside of just it being written in a document and being sort of something you have to tick off. I thought it was maybe you can talk a little bit about that conversation of, in the longer term, what the hope is for a lot of government institutions when it comes to collective action.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, there are different goals. And as I said, diversity is a huge thing here. And but where we kind of got this synergy, again, I like using that word in case I'm repetitive, it's that we do need to realize that this is already going on. So this is a thing that's already happening. So we need to take a role in order to, well, get into the boat, you know, bring the wine to the party in some sort of way. And so we have to address problems. We're doing businesses, private sector is doing businesses, and state enterprises are doing businesses. And we need to create this environment that you guys also said. And for that environment, we do need the state to get in. So we can provide and contemplate drafting documents, bills, laws, policies, frameworks. And that's what I think public sector brings to the table, but also contemplating that in different actors, because we talked about, for instance, what the prosecutor's role looks like in collective action, what does Supreme Audit Institution role look like. And so it's not just thinking about government, but also thinking about all these autonomous bodies that also have a role. So I think we really convene on the fact that we need to realize that. So that's something that's needed. And as to what we need to assess the real necessities from the private sector and civil society in order for those frameworks to actually reflect on what is needed to actually engage in collective action, and for it to have a proper and fitted result that works for everyone.
Super. Thank you. And I think there was also one really interesting comment from a colleague from coming from Ukraine about sort of looking into the future of seeing that for governments, it's no longer sort of an extra thing to do, but it's just simply something that they've internalized in the way that they approach. Whenever there's something that has to do with the private sector and or civil society, that collective action is the tool that they know and that they can choose to kind of get them there and to start those discussions. So thank you so much for that. Dion, we heard a lot about civil society's role, particularly around facilitation. And I was wondering whether you also discussed a little bit more of what actually makes a good facilitator, what the civil society have to bring to the table in order to really support these initiatives to move forward in an impactful way.
Yeah, we indeed had an interesting conversation and a bit of a deep dive into what makes for a good facilitator. And the two things that sort of surfaced first of all was what you need to bring to the party is integrity and competence. In other words, you must be trusted and you must have something solid, very often research-based to add. And I think it ties well in with what we've seen last year with the Edelman's Trust Barometer as well, that they also found that in order to be trusted, you always need two things. You need more things, but the two things that stand out is always integrity and ethics. And ethics matters the most. But they actually tried to put a weight on that and said about 76% of your trust capital always relates to your ethics. So therefore, the first thing that you need to be is that you need to be a trusted, competent player in the process. But then I think things like very active listening becomes important, so that you really hear what the respective parties has to say, what their real concerns are, and then also excellent communication skills, but not only internally within the collective action, but also your external communication in order to create that type of credibility. And then obviously, if you are playing a facilitator role, you need good facilitating, good mediation skills. And finally, I think also always to be seen as that advocate of the public interest, to ensure that this is not about only sectional benefits, but that the outcome of the whole process will be in the benefit of the public. So ultimately, it comes down again to what I said at the end, being that credible, competent broker in the process of facilitating the interaction between either private sector players or ideally private and public sector players.
Thank you, and it's so great to hear that from so many civil society initiatives that are actually engaged and actually doing it on the ground. So thank you for that. Cecilia, you mentioned in your summary of the discussion that generally the consensus from the companies that we're discussing was we need more. It should be integrated also into compliance systems. Was there any discussion around who within the company would be sort of responsible, how that would be driven, in reality, and also, of course, thinking back to your experience of how you started that, what your process looked like when you started the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network?
You know, we did talk about that in terms of where would the role sit, and are lawyers the most innovative person in the room? Always, that's a question we can debate. And like I said, I'm a lawyer myself, so that's why I think I'm entitled to say that. But I do think that the role of how companies, I mean, of course, if it's integrated on the top, if there's an understanding of how to approach it through maturity and compliance program building already in the company, I think that function can sit pretty much everywhere, right? It can sit in the legal department, it can sit in but I think one of my experience, you know, again, this was 10 years ago, but I think one of the reasons why I was allowed to pursue collective action, because I was actually sitting in a sustainability department that was working with integrity and ethics. So I think there was a bit of a more of an appetite for innovation, maybe than in a traditional legal and compliance function. But again, I think it's also about finding, as a compliance officer, you need to find those platforms for you to drive that. You are ultimately responsible for your compliance program to make that a success. And you're the one who's going to get hit if there is a smash in a high-risk market and the company hasn't done enough to mitigate those risks. So I do think we all, as a profession, we have an obligation to find those platforms, if it's here or if it's conferences that we go to, or if it's peers that we speak to. I think it goes hand in hand with the job description in the profession. But maybe platform-wise, I mean, if you go to traditional anti-corruption and sanctions conference today, collective action could be on, but it could also not be on, right? And maybe for a compliance officer, the Basel Institute of Governance is not the first thing they open in the morning. So I do think there is a role to play to push the professions of compliance officers and above to think about collective as a truly integrated part of an ABC program. To mitigate those risks, right? And a good thing is doing that is to put it in the settlements, because that we all read. So if they're more articulated need to do collective action in your compliance program, people will take it up from there.
Super. Fantastic. I think with that, we'll open up to questions. I see we have a couple already here, but also feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, let's kick off. Henty down there with a couple of in-person questions before we go to Slido.
Thank you, Scarlett. And I want to add on to what Cecilia actually just said in terms of settlements. I think the big elephant in the room is all of this costs money and resources. And I think, Siemens together with the World Bank, was kind of visionary to put that settlement together. The EIB, does that on a consistent basis as well. African Development Bank, actually, we did one with them. I'm not sure if that money's ever been used, but it's not consistent in terms of when companies get found guilty and go into settlement agreements, whether it's multilateral development banks or with governments, is that there's not enough focus on putting money aside to do good. And I think that's a unique collective action opportunity to kind of, drive that and to see how can we get that going in a better way, because the monies that's around now is not going to always be there. And of the top 10 or 20 settlement companies that the top ever, I think only Siemens is here. There's none of the others there. So how do we get more of the companies that's really done something wrong to kind of give back to their communities in an organized way?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can take one more question so we can cluster them a little bit, and then, yeah, Isadora, would you like to?
Hello. Yes. Good morning. Thank you very much for all your interventions. Very interesting. Well, I'm Isadora from the French Anti-Corruption Agency. I have a slightly provocative question to all of you. How do you prevent integrity washing? How each one of your stakeholders group can encourage and mainstream collective action while also ensuring that the initiatives are not cosmetic, that they are not just part of a marketing strategy, but they achieve real effective results in practice. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we can actually, I don't know if there's any follow-up from Henty's comment on the settlements. I don't know if finances were discussed. I know it's always a big question when it comes to collective action of who supports. There's a mention of government also stepping in, but I don't know if there's any follow-up on the comment from Henty that it would be good to also basically ensure that money that is coming back to governments because of wrongdoing actually also gets funneled into these preventive measures, so we can prevent this from happening in future, hopefully. Any additional comments on that?
Government or civil society?
You want to go?
I don't have a comment on that. More than I fully agree, but I think...
On Henty's comment on the settlements. Yeah, I think, and we often see it, I think if you really want a company not to do again what they have done in the past, is to make them responsible for exactly where things have gone wrong. And I think Siemens is an excellent example of that, but I can think of 2, 3, 4 other examples as well. While if as part of the settlement you make them responsible, if they were involved in bribery or corruption, to start focusing on preventing bribery and corruption, you really ingrain it into the DNA of that company. And ironically now, if you are looking for a good example of how do you do it, you go to a company like Siemens. I've seen similar things in the accounting profession, for example, where there were 2 cozy relationships between partners, and they signed off too easily on each other's external audits. That by making them responsible for doing something about that, they became an example, a global example, of how independence within the accountancy profession can be promoted. So I think, Henty, I can't agree more with you, and I really hope with you that there will be more of these cases, and I don't know what we as a group can do also to influence that agenda. I think it's vitally important.
Yes, especially looking into the future and sustainability of collective action. Thank you. Maybe to carry on with Isadora's question, and hand that over to you. How do you at the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network take that problem on?
Yeah. I'm going to try to be as crisp because this is so long. I can talk about this for a long time. But I think there are two things. I think there's recognizing what we are as an organization. We don't vet, we don't certify companies' compliance programs. We're really strong on that. There are vetting, there are certification bodies, there are audits of compliance programs. So we take on companies that have come a long way, but we also take on companies that have very little in terms of compliance. That is our role. We do a lot of capacity building, speaking with companies. We don't want to create a state-of-the-art club. We want to get people, we want people to come in and removing the needle while they're in the network, right? Which, from a culture bearer perspective, certain markets, we wouldn't have been in certain markets if we would advocate that we certify you need a perfect price. We actually had companies who've been waiting years to knock on our door because they don't think they're good enough or do they have, and they don't recognize the help they can get within the network. So I think we try to be very articulative of that approach and what we take, and we have different maturities, and we want to see companies growing. I think there is an appreciation of in the team when we see a company that has nothing that suddenly start to do e-learning and they start to go on board the vessel. So that's a fantastic story for us that we're moving the needle. We have an obligation in our operating charter that you know, if we don't see any type of engagement, they're not coming to the meetings, they don't do the obligations, we can formally kick them out. I think one of the strongest tools in terms of compliance maturity is that we have a self-assessment every year. And I don't think we realized the impact of that self-assessment when we launched it, but what they get back is a dashboard on how they are performing against their peer group. So apologize for being nerdy here, but if there's a container or a tanker, depending what segment they're in, they get a peer benchmark against are they better or worse than the competition, and then they get a benchmark how they're doing against the full membership. And again, we wanted to do that. So it's just a card you get as an individual company. But the push for that has been great, right? Because they look at that and it's easy. Management sees that, and why are we below our competition? Why are we not doing that? That has to trigger so much more discussions. So I think that it was a fairly, you know, it wasn't a formal process as a vetting or a certification, but it has really triggered an effect because, again, you do that peer benchmark, right? And then there's the whole peer pressure in an MACN. You have to recognize we have everybody's a part of the value chain. So you're sitting next to a customer, but you're also sitting next to a supplier, right? And you're sitting next to a competitor. So if your competitor says, we've done an amazing work, we are now not doing anything, you know, we have no harassment, no cases in Angola, and you're sitting here as an example, not pointing out Angola specifically, but as an example, and yourself sitting there and you've made no progress, you're going to go back and say, why aren't we doing the same? And I had customers in the room, and I had my suppliers in the room. So you can create, I think you create incentives and pressure points by having that inclusive, that collective action approach. Is greenwashing or ethics washing, I would also say it's a constant. That's also one of the challenges of growing an organization, right? That it's easy to keep track of 10 companies when we are 300, 400 companies. How do we do that then? And my answer to that is are they at members' meetings? We connect with them, we speak to them, we speak to different people in their team. We have a good pulse of the industry. And that's also why I think I'm a strong advocate for sector approaches, because you know who's in your group, both on the customer and the supplier chain, and you can build on that. So there's a longer conversation, but I hope I made it as crisp as possible. So
thank you. Are there a couple more questions? We have time for 2 more. So we'll start over here and then, okay, well, maybe 3, we'll see. Yes, please?
It's okay. I'm David Ogolo. I really wanted to speak around the issue to increase the legitimacy of the collective action, because so that he's not seen to see the value he could really add to tackling corruption is how it's perceived by the victims of corruption. What I mean by this is that this is a very difficult area that hasn't received really attention. For example, if you look at the grand corruption that is going on across the African continent, each of the ones that settlement has happened, nobody talks about the victim. So if collective action is going to be valued, the victim of the corruption has to play a role. And, most cases, yes, civil society speaks for the victim, they represent the victim, but the victim themselves also have their own organizations. They have their own, they need to be engaged, and for them to be part of this process of conversation. And I think that brings us to the questions of how do we measure results? So that can become a part of the indicator that the victim of a certain kind of corruption, for example, if there's corruption in Nigeria, the people that are the victim, so if you are trying to build a collective action, are they going to be part of it? If they are part of it, it increases the legitimacy of such initiative. And I would like to know how that is playing out in terms of at higher level, and what civil society can do, and what business can do, and what government can do. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have one more question just to cluster it? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Nempo Adilabu from University of Jos, Nigeria. Yeah. So I'm wondering, I'm in the academia and I'm thinking, what role can the academia play in collective action against corruption, particularly in creating awareness? Because there are people who don't even know what corrupt acts are and they engage in it. So how do we create awareness to the general public to know the consequences of corruption and then the acts of corruption itself? So what can the academia do to train students, to train the society, and then to create awareness on corruption? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to answer those two questions and then really, really quickly, and then maybe we can have two more. On the first question of including the victims and bringing really everybody to the table, I'd like to hand over to Daniela. I think she has a lot of experience in her organization of really bringing everyone to the table, and also the role governments can play in making sure all of those voices are heard.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanna take on that question and Isaura's question just to showcase a bit of an example that we have in Chile. So we, as the Supreme Audit Institution, lead an effort. It's actually an effort that's called the Anti-Corruption Alliance. And there, Mr. Bermudez yesterday talked a little bit about it. So we have 34 entities that come from the private sector, the public sector, the academia, and civil society, and we work together to realize the principles of the UNCAC in Chile. And there, driving from your question, Isadora, what we've done is we only enterprises and private sector participate, but only in the form of like gremios is the word in Spanish. So it's like collective, so chambers of commerce and those sort of things. And we actually, if you don't go into the integrity washing, if you don't comply with the principles of the UNCAC, that's like our standard, then you are no longer a part of the Anti-Corruption Alliance. And we actually have an example. I won't name and shame, but we have an example of a couple of entities that we actually had to ask them to leave the Anti-Corruption Alliance because they were not living by the UNCAC principle standards. And coming to the academia question, so we have this experience and we have a couple of universities that have come to work with us. And there, for instance, this is the 10-year anniversary. This is an alliance that's on a voluntary basis, and that's where political will is, of course, then again important, because it's not, we don't have a law or a framework that says, okay, you need to do this. And the academia has also come to the table in the sense of actually discussing what corruption means in Chile, because of course we need to have this tailor-made vision of what corruption looks like in a country that, of course, was not talking about corruption that much 10 years ago. And we actually have been trying to mainstream anti-corruption efforts. For instance, this year, as we celebrate our 10th anniversary, we're having the first ever student congress on anti-corruption that's led by one of the universities, University of Valparaiso. So we're also trying to get things out of Santiago, which is the capital. And we are having an open call of proposal from students, university students, to discuss integrity and anti-corruption. And I feel just having that conversation is a plus among students, because also there's like no, I mean, in Chile, but sometimes it's hard to actually have a course on integrity, like a proper former. I can bet that everyone, or almost everyone that's here, has a career that drives from criminal law, or maybe like sort of areas of corruption, but not really studies of integrity, you know? That's not proper in Chile yet. It's not like a part of any I don't know the name in English, but it's not like proper part of your studies. So we're trying to drive from there to get that conversation going. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and academia, just to say, is of course a really important stakeholder to raise awareness, and I think we can definitely connect, because there's a lot of opportunities for academia to get involved. Just very quickly to wrap it up, I think there's one more question over here and one more over there, and then we are ending this discussion. Thank you.
Antonio from the Swiss Liechtenstein network. How about if we would connect all these reflections we are doing here stronger into the debate of sustainability, which is on the top agendas of governments, businesses, etc., because it's core, the whole thing. That's the first thought. The second thought, we should somehow connect it also to the Agenda 2030 with the SDGs, especially SDG 16. I'm a bit astonished that we didn't have any link to that yesterday and today. And the third part, it's also a question here. I think it's absolutely crucial, we had that in the discussion yesterday, to involve the investment and finance sector, because they have the big leverage. If they pressurize, things will change very, very fast.
Thank you. Can we add the final question? And sorry, no more questions after that. We're going to have to wrap up. Just the one question over here.
Yes. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to also compliment with regards to the role of academics. With the Global Compact, we have a sister initiative called the Principles for Responsible Management Education. And they have they developed, under the Siemens project, a tool to train, future leaders on the fight against corruption. So you can always get in touch with our Principles for Responsible Management Education, as well as the tool that was developed under the Siemens project. On what my colleague just said with regards to investors, actually the Global Compact also a few years ago, we realized that investors play a great part, in terms of the behavior of companies. And we also engage with the Principle for Responsible Investment. And we have developed a tool also in terms of how investors can make anti-corruption and investment decision. We have that also on our website. Now, to my question. A few years ago, we had one of our Siemens initiative project was ending in a country. And I did speak with multinational, and that why can't you just, given the fact that we don't have funding again, can you please support this project so that it doesn't end at this stage? And I was told collective action is Siemens project. So how do you want me to put my money in the Siemens initiative? So while I acknowledge the role that Siemens has played, because now it seems that the perception is that collective action is synonymous with Siemens. And therefore the company CEO said, I'm not going to put my money in that because it is Siemens. So how do you address this sort of challenge? It's a great, like I said, it's acknowledging the role of Siemens. But now that some companies have really now associated collective action with Siemens, and they will not want to put their money into that. What do we do? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for raising the importance of diversifying the funding. Maybe we can kick off, or would you want to follow up on that, or kick off with the ESG?
But I can talk about, you know, a part of that challenge is, of course, that, you know, and I think that was a key driver when we got established, that there has to be also financial commitment for companies to join. I mean, the Siemens is a great starting point, but I think it's really important. It's these type of projects shouldn't necessarily always be funded by donors, governmental donors or private donors. I mean, there needs to be an interest for the private sector to, and I think it's also part of the obligation, sorry to say to be frank, but also of the project to articulate the benefit of business to take part financially and commitment. And I think there is a strong value of financially commit to something. When MACN got started, we were 20 companies, right? And, you know, the money wasn't, you know, enormous. It was a few thousands of dollars to commit, but the value in itself that I'm paying for something, but I also should also get something, right? So we have to really articulate the value for business if they're going to continue to play a role. And that's, to be honest, that's not necessarily always the societal impact, right? That is, you refer to it as in the investment environment, right? So why should business invest to mitigate risk? Why should they care? We have to articulate that, because it's not sure that a managing director of a country necessarily see that unless it's clearly supported from the top. But project also needs to articulate that if we want business to play a part in that. So I think that's extremely important that conversation is taken when the project starts and not only when the project ends.
Thank you. Dion, would you like to jump in on the ESG question maybe, or SDG?
Yeah, I would like to end there, but I would like to start by saying I think the last question reflects how successful Siemens were. They were uber successful to the extent that people see it now as a Siemens methodology, which of course is all wrong. And we did open up that question yesterday, and we asked the civil society groups, what do they think should collective action also focus on? And exactly what you said came out tops. Environmental protection, mitigating climate change. There's huge scope for collective action there, as there is for issues around human rights, gender justice, inclusion. As there is for the promotion of good governance and integrity in organizations. And I think, especially not in this part of the world, but in the part of the world where I come from, community development, especially in the face of crumbling infrastructure. We can't rely on government to fix sometimes even roads and electricity. You need the involvement of the private sector and of civil society and others also to focus on those issues. So yeah, Siemens was extremely successful to focus collective action on anti-corruption, and it works, and it's wonderful. But it would be a pity if this methodology gets restricted to that.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. I think we could continue discussing for the rest of the day and maybe tomorrow, but unfortunately we have run out of time. It's been a delight to discuss with all of you, and thank you so much to my other panelists for all their inputs and their summaries. Please don't see this as the end of the discussion. I think it's really more the beginning in many ways to continue in the break we have now, but also please feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions, and we will of course be trying to capturing all of the lessons and outputs of those discussions and drive this discussion further and hopefully pick it up at the next conference where we're hoping to see all of you. So we unfortunately have to wrap up. We have now a very short coffee break, and then we've already will be picking up our last panel, which will be looking at connecting the dots between corruption and human rights. So also a fascinating topic. See you all back then, and enjoy your coffee, and thank you so much.